This episode of our podcast is generously sponsored by Irene and David Bythe in memory of David's parents, Hannah and Werner Bythe, who were both fortunate to escape Nazi Germany before the war. Let us start with a German lesson. The word is Erbe. It means both inheritance and legacy. Today's guests have spent more than a decade sitting with that word. One of them grew up in a German-Jewish household on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, surrounded by relatives who had fled Nazi Germany, in a family where the unspoken motto was forward, never back. The other grew up in post-war Austria, the granddaughter of a man who volunteered for the Wehrmacht, Hitler's United Armed Forces of Nazi Germany, and a family that kept its silence about what that meant and why. And yet, remarkably, these two people found each other. They traveled together through Germany, France, Austria, and the Netherlands on a joint journey of discovery and empathy. The result is a book called Inheritance, Love, Loss, and the Legacy of the Holocaust. A memoir unlike almost any other in the crowded literature of Holocaust memory because it is written across the deepest moral divide of the 20th century, between the descendants of victims and the descendants of perpetrators. Welcome to this podcast, to be continued, Reflections on Growing Up with Holocaust Survivors, where we explore the intersections of memory, identity, and resilience. Our goal is to lift up the experiences of children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and to ask, how did those memories form you? How did resilience create you as the person you are today? And what is the legacy that you will leave to those who come after you? I am your host, Rabbi Jeff Salkin, and our guests are Charlie Scheidt, born in New York City, the son of German Jewish refugees. His father, Bruno, fled Frankfurt in 1933. His mother, Suze, followed, as did many other close family members. But unfortunately, others did not and became trapped in the Nazi vice in Germany, Holland, and France. And when Charlie's mother died in 1988, she left behind an armoire containing nearly 1,000 documents, letters, visas, identity papers, a baby's autopsy report that Charlie could not bring himself to absorb and deal with for 20 years. Kat Rohrer is an award-winning Austrian filmmaker whose films include Back to the Fatherland, a documentary about Israelis living in Germany. Her maternal grandfather was a devout Nazi officer, a true believer, who died fighting in Yugoslavia before her mother was born. Her family, her mother, her grandmother, her great aunt, who, by the way, married a Jew and escaped to Australia, did not speak of him. Charlie and Kat met almost by accident when Kat was filming the 75th anniversary of Charlie's company, Roland Foods. He noticed she spoke German. A few months later, he asked if she might help him translate some papers. She said yes, because, as she told him, she had a personal interest in that period of history. It would be some time before he understood what that meant. Eventually, she sent him an email. It was time, she said, that he knew her story. She told him that she had been haunted all her life by the same patch of ash that haunted his family. What followed was 15 years of research, 4 trips to Europe, hundreds of conversations with strangers who turned out to be guardians of forgotten memory, and a book that refuses easy comfort, tidy conclusions, or the warm illusion that history is over. Today, they are here to talk about all of it. Charlie and Kat, welcome. It's good to have you here. Both of you grew up in families where the war was present but almost never spoken of. Charlie, in a German Jewish home in New York, Kat in post-war Austria. What did that silence sound like? What did it teach you, even when nothing was being said?
The silence was pervasive. Uh, it was the past was a taboo subject, and as you said, it was a matter of constantly looking forward. That generation and my parents and the people I grew up around were focused on creating a new life, and thinking back and living in the past was painful to them, and they tried by being silent to spare me from the knowledge and the horrors of what they had witnessed and what the family had lived through. It was a way of protecting the next generation, but frankly, it didn't work because the anxiety was so pervasive and the sense that the subject was a taboo was something I could not avoid, and that affected the relationships in the family. And I was aware of something strange in some of the relationships, so that the silence was didn't work. And to grow up around the silence is does not solve the issue of the past, and is frankly one of the reasons for this book, to break open that silence.
What's it like for you, Kat?
It's a different kind of silence because my family did talk about what my grandfather was, and that he volunteered and that he was a devout Nazi. So I grew up. I can't tell you a time where I didn't know this fact. What we didn't talk about is him as a person, because in actuality my grandmother died when I was 3, so I couldn't ask her. And my great aunt, who became my de facto grandmother, who had fled to Australia, I was too young to ask her questions about why she came back in the summers to Austria, to society that didn't want her, that she had to flee. So I don't know, and that was just because she had passed away when I was old enough to ask. But the minute I asked about why my great aunt wasn't living in Austria, my mom told me why. So it was less of a silence. It was more of a, we know this is a fact, but we don't need to know more. And because I'm a third generation, I have the benefit of time and being more removed. I started to ask questions, what my grandfather had done and where he had been.
Charlie, you don't have to be silent anymore, luckily. And I want this to make sense to our listeners. So, could you give us a brief synopsis of your family's Holocaust experience?
The Holocaust experience is in several countries. So let's start with Germany, where much of the family left, but part of the family did not. And he, in fact, was injured in the First World War, and for the longest time thought he would be safe. Unfortunately, that did not turn out to be true. Then we had family in Holland. There again, Holland had been neutral in World War One, and many people in Holland, not just Jews, thought that they would be safe in World War II as a neutral party. And that turned out not to be true. Uh, and then we had family in France. Uh, France, of course, there was uh, the fake war. Um, there's a French expression, but the drôle de guerre, and there was a period from the declaration of war in September 1939 until the Blitzkrieg in April, that people could have the illusion that this too would pass. And unfortunately, it did not. And of course, we ended up with family in Vichy, France, in the southern France. Uh, and that's a difficult story. So it's really a story in those 3 countries, and how people coped, or and tried to tried to save themselves and hoped for the best. And uh, for some, unfortunately, what actually did happen.
Let's talk about a piece of furniture. A week before your mother died in 1988, she told you about the papers in the armoire. And she had kept those papers hidden for decades. And then at the very end, she told you where they were. What was she saying to you? What was she giving you permission to do? And why do you think she kept them hidden for more than 50 years?
My parents, like so much of that generation, and as we said before, simply looked forward. The past was scary, was upsetting, and creating a life in a new country is not easy. It's not easy for any refugee or immigrant. So they worked very hard. They tried very hard to give me everything they possibly could in terms of education and a good solid life. So that's that's the ethos that they embraced, and I was the beneficiary of. Um, but by the time my mother was uh, later in her later years, and so ill in those final years, couple of years, she must have come to the conclusion that the time had come for me to know what that history really was. She didn't have the time or the energy to really dissect it all and tell me everything. But she wanted me to know that she had hidden all those documents and that she had saved them. And she encouraged me to look at them and then decide what I wanted to do with them. In a sense, she bequeathed them to me.
Kat, your mother was born after her father was killed in Yugoslavia. And like Charlie's family, she didn't want to linger in the past. But there's a difference between not talking about it and not being affected by it. Those are two very different things. When did you first find out about your grandfather? Who told you? And what happened inside you when you learned?
I honestly I can't remember. I think there's not a time that I remember growing up that I didn't know. The reason I imagine I asked that question pretty early was because my great aunt, who had immigrated to or had fled to Australia, came every summer to take care of me because my mom was a single mom and was working. So I guess at one point I asked why she wasn't living in Austria, and my mom told me. And then obviously in school, when you go through the history, it all started to be pieced together. Um, I think when I was first affected, or really started in my adult life grapple with it, was when I moved to New York. When I moved to New York, and I had a colleague in university that was Israeli, and we had a conversation. We're talking about Austria, and he was saying, he made a joke, and said, he did mean it as a joke. I didn't find it particularly funny. He said, "Your grandparents killed my grandparents," and I swallowed and I took a deep breath, and for a long time, I didn't want to introduce myself as being from Austria because it was hard to admit that. Um, but with years, and with me learning more about the history and also learning more about my family history, and with Charlie's project and with making the movie, you know, I became more forward and just telling the story because, there's no point in hiding it.
Charlie, you asked Kat to help you translate documents. You knew she was Austrian. You knew she was a filmmaker. You knew that she spoke German, but you didn't know her full story yet. So when she finally sent you that email telling you that she had been haunted by the same patch of ash, what did that moment do to you? What did it mean to you?
she really asked the question how that would affect my willingness to work with her. And I simply answered that we don't know what we will find in the papers that I had inherited. Who knows what's there? And in fact, how will how will that affect anything? Because she is who she is, and I am who I am, and w- each of us is responsible for ourselves. And I believe I even said the sins of the father or grandfather in her case are not her sins. So for me, it was a matter of starting to work together, getting to know each other better, and getting to appreciate each other. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't work, well, then we'll go on with our lives. Uh, and fortunately, it did work. And
Yeah, I
for
guess I'd say 15 years down the road, I think it works.
yes, yes, uh, and in a way, it's a deep friendship because of partially because of those differences and an appreciation, which I also gained of what it means to be in her position. It's, you have to deal with a certain reality that um, I don't have to deal with.
I think by naming the teaching that the sins of the parents do not fall upon the children, which is from the book of Ezekiel, you're actually naming one of the great internal reforms of the Hebrew Bible, uh, which is that rather than visiting the sins of the parents upon the third and fourth generation, that this doesn't exist anymore, and it's how we are able to move forward. Um, so the question is, this is a collaboration between the child of victims and the grandchild of a perpetrator. This is not a symmetrical relationship. I think it would be wrong to pretend that it is. So, how did you navigate that asymmetry? Were there moments when it felt impossible to stand on equal ground?
To finding out the truth, to finding out history, and to learning from history, and understanding the reality of what past generations have gone through, what they have dealt with, how they have dealt with the realities, and where that what that teaches us in terms of what we do with our lives.
I mean, there's so many, there's so many other aspects of us potentially not being on equal ground. I mean, Charlie is older, Charlie has more life experience. I'm younger, he's an accomplished businessman. I was just starting out with my business. So there's many, many other things. I think, that history, despite it being, that family history, despite it being very different, it's the lingering grasp this history has on our lives in a way, albeit very, very different, that actually puts us on equal footing because I understand where Charlie's coming from. Another person, you know, may not have understood it as well. So I think in that respect, we were very complementary to each other and with each other. And we had conversations that were very important for both of us, but also, expanded our horizons when it comes to understanding, for me to understand Charlie or Charlie understanding me, and together understanding history.
This is such an interesting relationship to me, and I know to our viewers and listeners. How does each of your pasts help you understand the other? And were there moments when your opposite inheritances actually clarified something that neither of you could have seen on your own?
I think the perspectives. I mean, the more important than being from different sides is that we're from two different generations. So Charlie because he knew his parents and he grew up with them, and was so adamant about looking forward because that's what he had been taught, was in occasions afraid to ask questions. Me being the third generation, being removed, not having a relationship with my grandparents because they were both dead, and having had a very open relationship, discussion with my mother, and seeing some of the not wanting to look back but forward for a different reason, but the same mechanisms, um allowed me to know how to, you know approach certain subject matters with Charlie, and to maybe nudge him into looking in certain areas that he maybe didn't want to look into.
Nudge is a gentle word. I would say push, but I was willingly pushed because what I realized over time, and you mentioned earlier, Jeff, that for 20 years I really could not deal with the inheritance. Now I rationalized that by saying I was busy building and running a business, raising a family, living in the present. But I think emotionally, what I realized in the course of working with Kat was that I was also protecting myself emotionally from the past, and that the world in which I had grown up had taught me to do that, to live in the present, and that the time had come really for me emotionally to deal with it, to understand it, and to understand how has affected the world in which I grew up.
Kat, you were a very important part, really an integral part of Charlie's research. You were a researcher, translator, travel companion, and something harder to name. Was any part of this work for you a way of trying to make amends? And if so, can amends actually be made across a divide this wide?
I don't think I can make amends for something that happened 40 years before I was born, that, by someone I didn't even know. So I don't think I can make amends for anything. What I can do, and I think that is the responsibility for the descendants of the perpetrators, is to take responsibility. Or in my case, help Charlie, go on this journey with him, and have this amazing experience of finding out about this family history and preserving it, because very often family histories are not preserved. And I could use my knowledge. I mean, Charlie speaks perfect German, but my, let's say, my talents in an archive and my talents in, looking for the needle in the haystack, to help him find the answers that he was looking for. So I think that is it making amends. No, it was helping along and, taking ownership or responsibility for the history that my grandfather somehow was a part of.
You stayed overnight at La Ricoquette, the house in Normandy where your Uncle Max, Charlie, and Aunt Erna lived before Max was sent to an internment camp. You wrote that you felt you were inhabiting the present and the past simultaneously. What does that actually feel like? Can you take us into that house and into that moment?
It was not only in that house that I had the experience. It the very first time was quite by serendipity when we luckily were invited into or convinced somebody to let us into an apartment in Germany that my maternal grandparents had lived in. And suddenly being in that space and imagining them in that space really changed the way we approach future trips. And the and you mentioned the experience in Normandy. That was living in the present because here, and I'll just mention, for example, sitting in the garden, and it's a it's a beautiful Sunday morning, and enjoying it and appreciating it, and then at the same time remembering and hearing my aunt and uncle's letters that they had written from that backyard. And for example, imagining my uncle chasing his cat, his tomcat, who liked to climb a tree. So I was living in that past and appreciating it uh, in a way by just being there, uh, and it was quite an overwhelming feeling, uh, and I think it enriched our experiences immensely.
Now, Charlie, in terms of these journeys that you took, you also went to Paris with Kat to trace your family's footsteps, and you found the streets and the apartments where they had lived. But when you traveled to Paris with your parents when you were growing up as a child, they never took you to those neighborhoods. So, what did it mean to walk those streets now without them and without ever having been taken there?
The first thing that came to mind is, why didn't you take me here? What what's going on? You took me to see some sights. You took me to you introduced me to a cafe and a croissant in Paris, but you didn't show me where you had lived and why. And I could only conclude that it was in a way painful for them. They had been very they seemed to have been very happy there. They were newlyweds. They were living in Paris. For example, when my father loved Charlie Chaplin movies, and when we came out of a place that they had lived, I looked to the side, and there was the Chaplin Movie House. It still has that name on it. So I was sorry that they hadn't, and yet I think it was part of that pattern of not going back, because I'm sure their memories were very, very bittersweet, because so many of the people, I mean, we did trace some of the people who were mentioned in correspondence and or did not make it into the book, but did not survive. So a lot of people that they may have been not have been family, you know, the memories and thinking back about them, I think was painful, and they avoided it.
Kat, there was a moment in Amsterdam when a teacher produced a book of research about Jewish students who had been expelled under Nazi occupation. And inside it, you found a handwritten note by Charlie's cousin Eileen. Take us back to that room. What happened there?
We had planned the first day, and we were going back then. It was our first trip, so we only visited the outside of some of the apartments that the family had lived in. And last on our list was to go to that school that Charlie's cousin went to. While we were driving there, I realized that wasn't very smart of us, because the school was probably closed. So we went anyway, because we said, something to check off our list, and see a plaque and see what it looked like from the outside. But when we were there, there was Charlie went to the entrance of the school, and tried to pull the door, but the door was locked. But in the moment, I believe a teacher who was also, or maybe the headmistress, walked out, and Charlie stopped her and said if we could enter and see the plaque that was there in commemoration of the Jewish students of that school. And she let us in, and we told her the story, and she said, "Well, you should really talk to this teacher named Ronald, because Ronald wrote a book about them." Um, and Ronald wasn't supposed to be there at this time. It was afternoon. The kids were gone. He was supposed to be home, but Ronald happened to be in the school at the time. So she went and got him, and we talked to him, and he showed us the book he had written, and we thumbed through it and ended up on a page, and we both looked at the this picture of this handwriting, and it seemed oddly familiar. And we looked closer, and the caption said that it was by Aileen Lissauer, who had written this poem for a classmate, and Aileen was the Charlie's cousin. And so we asked him where he got this from, and he said he got it from a classmate, Betsy Vandermeer, and Betsy actually was still alive. So thanks to Ronald, we were able to connect with Betsy, and we met with her a year later. She was still alive, and she showed us pictures and shared stories with us about Charlie's cousin, and that was one of those very, very many fortuitous coincidences that we experienced on these trips.
And experiencing, I would just add, very helpful people, which we constantly experienced in each country. I mean, you asked before about Normandy, and it's amazing to have been invited to not only to see the house that my aunt and uncle had rented, but to sleep in that very same house. Uh, and they certainly didn't know a thing about us when they invited us to do so.
The book is very honest, Charlie, about your favorite aunt Lilo, who miraculously survived Bergen-Belsen and the Ravensbrück concentration camps. Now, Charlie, you were born in 1943, and Lilo came to New York after the war, and you were very close to her as a child. Did you actually feel her grief even before you could name it? And do you believe that you carry some portion of her trauma in your own body?
Leela was my favorite aunt. She was a warm, loving presence. And I think that began when she first came here after the war. And eventually I would stay with her and her husband. And it was a very close connection. And I always felt her pain. Her pain was so obvious, was so real. And there was a certain tension with other members of the family. And I always felt protective of her. And yes, I think I did absorb some of her pain. Uh, and uh, it is, I would say, it is with me to this day.
Now, your father, Bruno, always worried that what happened in Germany could happen again in America. By the way, we hear this quite often from people. And he wanted you to be, these are his words now, adept, alert, and ready in case it ever stopped being safe to be a Jew in America. I speak these words and I tremble to say them. So we're witnessing a very rapid and severe rise in anti Semitism right now on a daily basis. Do you ever think about his fears? And have you talked about this with your own children?
Oh, I grew up around that fear. And I would say the fear was and is not limited to the United States. I mean, it is a pervasive reality. And that is what my father preached, what he believed and preached. Uh, and one must be realistic about it. There's an ebb and a flow, but when there is a flow, you want to be very much aware of it. Now, the difficulty, of course, is knowing where one is at any particular moment. And he was certainly somebody who had a very keen sense of when the danger is really overwhelming.
What's very interesting to me about what you're saying is that when I have this conversation with people, I have to remind them that Germany in 1936 and 1937 wasn't always Germany in 1937. It first had to be Germany in 1932 and Germany in 1926. And the truth is that we only know through 2020 hindsight exactly when it gets bad. And our early warning systems really, in some ways, have to be recalibrated over and over again, don't they?
Yes, that's very well said.
Now, Kat, over to you. You know, You've said that for many years you felt, well, there's no other way of putting it. You felt guilty, you felt shame, even though none of these were choices that you made. And you were born 40 years after the fact, and you made that very clear. And every understanding of Jewish ethics and theology that I have come to understand would speak to that. Charlie, did you feel anything like that on your side? I mean, not guilt. I'm not talking guilt. I mean, something. And do either of you think that there is such a thing as inherited guilt, or is it something else? Is it, uh, I struggle to look for the words, a wound, a grief, a responsibility that has no name?
I would call it a scar. I think the generation that lives through these terrible events is was scarred. The individuals are scarred. Individuals who live through terrible events today are scarred, and those scars are passed on. And we the next generations deal with them. And the question is, how do we deal with them, and what do we do as a result of those feelings and those experiences, even though they were not our experiences? We know about them and we feel them and need to do something with them for our lives and also for the lives of our children and grandchildren and future generations.
Kat, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, I think we carry a unique sense of responsibility, honestly. So I think it is my generation um, or hopefully the subsequent generations' responsibility to make sure or try as best as we can, at least within the countries or within the realm that we are in, to that something like that doesn't happen again. Be out because we are. Always feel like our warning systems are uniquely tuned. I mean, for different reasons. Obviously, Charlie's warning system is very different than mine. But I feel very strongly when there is a political current in Austria or in Europe, a far right current that my alarm systems go off and I feel the need to do something and not just watch because dealing with the history and having studied it and knowing, having read letters that my grandfather wrote when he was 16 and stuff like that, I have a different insight. And I know that a lot of people in my generation in Austria who share the history of the perpetrator have that same feeling and passion. I mean, my mom has been a journalist and spent her entire lifetime trying to make sure that democracy is defended in Austria.
It's so interesting to me, Kat. We debate a lot in the Jewish education world and the Jewish communal world how effective Holocaust education has been. And one of the great truths that I live with is that whereas the facts of the Holocaust might have gone over the heads of many of our would be students, the fine tuning of the alarm system is something that has come across the generations and actually works. In fact, it works so much that it might overwork. How often we resort to the metaphor of the Nazis and the roundups and the concentration camps. It's almost a kind of political hypochondria. But we might argue that a little hypochondria is not such a bad thing, is it?
No, it's not a bad thing. I mean, you better be oversensitive and over alert than miss the signs, I would say.
That seems like a very Jewish thing to say. Though my father used to say, whenever my car was making weird noises, he used to say to me, Jeffrey, not every cough is pneumonia, but sometimes they are. There's something else that's going on right now in America and in Europe, and that's about refugees. This is the story you tell, ultimately a story about refugees, and millions of refugees today are bearing a stigma. They're being turned away just as your parents were. Your family foundation carries your parents' names and supports refugee protection. What do you want people to understand about the line that connects what your family endured to what is happening at the borders around the world right now?
I'm glad you raised the issue of refugees today because my family were refugees. They were stateless. They dealt with bureaucracy, changing laws, uncertainty, and ultimately with their very existence, their ability to survive. And the story of my family as refugees certainly echoes for me with the story of refugees and the plight of refugees today. And I I have noticed that in the book talks that we've given, how the children of refugees from other parts of the world and also first generation immigrants to the United States really relate to this story of refugees and understand the story that we tell in the book, and that for them, in the course of reading the book, their understanding of the Holocaust goes beyond 6 million, which is this um, which has no names, it has no people, but our book is a story of refugees that others can relate to.
And in so doing, can hear the echoes of the Jewish experience within their own experience. I remember years
Exactly.
ago encountering a Vietnamese refugee, an author named Biton Thuy, and she was talking about her experiences uh, escaping from the Viet Cong, um, the travails of being in the South China Sea, and uh, facing being attacked by pirates. It was a horrific story. And she said publicly that what gave her strength was the soaking wet copy of the Diary of Anne Frank that she had with her, that she read that book. And she said, that's what gave me the strength. You know, the book ends with a line. I want to read it back to you, Charlie. I'm going to ask you just to sit with it for a moment. I love this. The work on this book, the travels, research, reading, and questions, became a way to end the familial cycle of silence. I did it because nothing is more important than giving meaning to the loss and suffering. Without that, the oppressors own the story. The oppressors own the story. And the book is called Inheritance. At the end of this 15-year journey, what do you actually, Charlie, want to pass on? Not just to your own children and grandchildren, but to every person who reads this book and to every person who hears this conversation today. What do you want them to own of this?
I would like them to own the fact that it is up to each one of us to make a difference, that it doesn't have to be this way, and that we must be sensitive and empathize with the quote unquote others in the world, whether they're refugees and immigrants or defined in other ways, that the hope for for us as Jews and for all people everywhere is to get away from the the fear of people who are have different skin colors, different religions, different habits, and there is hope if we create the hope. We must not throw up our hands and give up.
Well, for us in this world, the greatest sign of hope is having a child, teaching a child, nurturing a child. Kat, you now have a child.
I do.
How old is your kid?
He's 9.5 months.
Wonderful. Congratulations. Mazel
Thank
tov.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
So there's going to come a time, as our tradition says, when your child will ask you, what do you want your child and any future children? What are you going to tell them about all of this?
Well, he's going to be able to read the book, right? When he's old enough. But when it comes to my family history, I'm going to tell him the truth. I'm going to tell him, I'm going to tell him about his grandfather and, my great aunt, who was, a very important influence on my life. And I'm going to tell him about the travels with Charlie and what we learned and how important it is to ask questions. And I want him to ask me as many questions as he can when, while I'm still alive, because that makes it a lot easier. Plus, keep in mind, we had all these wonderful letters to kind of reconstruct Charlie's family history with emails and the cloud. I'm not sure and text messages. I'm not sure my son is going to be able to do that. So he better ask questions while I'm still around.
Charlie and Kat, the two of you are quite a team of warriors from memory. What the two of you have proven, really, from the different sides of this abyss, is that honest memory is possible and necessary, that reckoning is possible and necessary, that you can hold a letter that was never intended for your eyes. You can walk a street your family was afraid to show you, and you can stand at a grave you never knew existed. And you can come out the other side not broken, but more whole. The oppressors, they wanted silence. They wanted to own the story. But the two of you, Charlie and Kat, you've made sure that they don't. Inheritance, Love, Loss, and the Legacy of the Holocaust is available now. You need to read this book, and there will be links in the show notes. This has been a really rare privilege for me and for all of us. This episode is a production of the 2G, 3G project, produced and edited by Ellie Hershko and co-directed by our podcast founder, Cheryl Hoffman. Once again, I'm your host, Rabbi Jeff Salkin. You can find To Be Continued, this podcast, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Audible, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you believe that these 2G and 3G voices are important and valuable, there are several ways that you can support us. First, hit the follow button on your podcast app. This way you won't miss an episode. Second, we're going to ask that you please share an episode with your friends and family and on your social media pages. And third, won't you please consider supporting what we do? We are fiscally sponsored by Jewish Creativity International, a 501c3 nonprofit. We rely on donors for their generosity and vision to help us keep producing our show and telling these stories. Please contact us at info@tobecontinuedpodcast. That's one word, tobecontinuedpodcast.org. Until next month, thank you for your support, and thank you so much for listening.